Hi guys, today I want to discuss the work of Tony O'Connell. I'll be talking about his online encyclopedia dedicated to the topic of Atlantis. I'll then provide you with a review of his book and my opinions on it. Finally, I want to talk about some news that Tony published on his website back in December. Okay, let me tell you a little about Tony O'Connell before we look into his work. From his website we can see that O'Connell was born in Dublin in 1943. Like many others of his generation, university wasn't an option for him, yet he still managed to work his way up the career ladder. First through a series of minor clerical jobs before working his way up to director at a small electrical company. O'Connell would go on to establish 2 companies of his own before he retired to County Leitrim with his partner. O'Connell's interest in ancient history was probably sparked by writers such as Eric von Daniken. From here he looked into the work of far more rational researchers before undertaking his own research. The first Atlantis-related book O'Connell can remember reading is Jürgen Spanath's Atlantis of the North. Atlantopedia was only supposed to be a modest retirement project for O'Connell. It was intended to be an A to Z compilation of about 200 entries. This was to be published as a book with the title The Atlantis Encyclopedia. Unfortunately, this title was already taken by Frank Joseph, so the book was released under the name Atlantopedia. O'Connell soon realized that the subject of Atlantis was too large to confine to a book, so he continued to develop Atlantopedia as a website. At the time of writing this script, I counted a total of 2,360 entries in the Atlantopedia index. O'Connell's website has been in continuous development for nearly 2 decades, roughly a quarter of his life. You can see that the website is updated daily, with multiple amendments to existing entries, with the occasional new entry thrown in for good measure. O'Connell's encyclopedia has been extremely useful for myself, and I'd imagine the same goes for many other Atlantis researchers. I just wish I found it sooner, as it would have accelerated the development of my first few videos. Each entry is well referenced and provides links to various sources, including books, papers, and other websites. I would argue, however, that some of the entries in Atlantopedia can be rather scathing. I totally support O'Connell's right to dismiss some of the more fantastical ideas regarding Atlantis, but seeing as this is supposed to be an encyclopedia, perhaps his dismissal of these ideas could be worded a little more neutrally. That said, this is O'Connell's website, he can say what he wants, and it's still an incredibly useful resource. And to be honest, I've gotten off rather lightly, for now. I don't think there's anybody alive today who has done more research into the subject of Atlantis than Tony O'Connell. With that in mind, it would then seem obvious that O'Connell would go on to write a book proposing his own hypothesis on the mythical Atlantis. O'Connell's book, released in 2018, is called Joining the Dots: Plato's Atlantis in the Central Mediterranean. I'll try to summarize Joining the Dots without giving too much away. I don't want to issue too many spoilers for those interested in reading the book. From the outset, it's clear that O'Connell is well read on the subject of Atlantis. He doesn't dive straight into his hypothesis, instead he first gives the reader a good background on how the story was first transferred from the Egyptians to Solon, before it was eventually received by Plato some time later. The book even dedicates some space to the credibility of the story. Joining the Dots clearly demonstrates that the Atlantis narrative had very obviously been Hellenized, so that the story could be made more relevant to Plato's audience. The Hellenization of the text meant that it would have been suitably embellished, in keeping with the literary conventions of the day, but still rooted in real historical elements. O'Connell clearly understands that there are some questions pertaining to the Atlantis narrative that simply cannot be resolved. He further explains how translation difficulties only add to any confusion. He understands why there are so many different ideas on the location and time frame of Atlantis. Before finally moving on to his own hypothesis, O'Connell spends some time exploring some of the more popular theories on the Atlantis subject and why he disagrees with them. When we do arrive at O'Connell's hypothesis, he starts off by dissecting Plato's numbers. In fact, Plato's numbers forms the largest chapter of the book. O'Connell explores the contradictions in Plato's numbers. He clearly demonstrates that some of Plato's numbers are simply impossible, and comes up with viable solutions to explain his own proposed alternatives, the most important of which is that the Atlantis story took place in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. O'Connell continues with his dissection of Plato's narrative and goes on to explain why he believes that Atlantis was not a single kingdom, but a military alliance of various peoples in the central Mediterranean, forming an axis from Tuscany to northwest Africa, with the possibility of having an island capital now lost somewhere under the Mediterranean Sea. Towards the end of the book, O'Connell spends some time exploring the possible identity of the various peoples that would have made up the Atlanteans, but quite rightly doesn't commit to his speculative ideas. Hopefully that was enough of a spoiler-free summary of the book, because I want to move on to my evaluation. Firstly, let's get the obvious things out of the way. The book is well written, concise, and easy to read. Everything is well referenced and a comprehensive bibliography can be found towards the back of the book. O'Connell demonstrates that he is very clearly an authority on the subject of Atlantis. The chapters are laid out logically. O'Connell guides us towards his ideas, first by giving us a background on the subject, introducing his ideas, then expanding upon those ideas to arrive at his conclusions. I found that I spent very little time flipping back and forward between pages, showing that great care has been taken to sequence the chapters. Writing this type of book is different to writing fiction. A story will nearly always follow a linear progression. When writing non-fiction, it's not always clear how the chapters should progress, so it's always a good idea to get a few honest friends to proofread and provide some feedback. This has clearly been done. There's a lot of information to take in with this book. O'Connell provides a summary in bullet point form prior to the epilogue. This is a handy addition, but I would also recommend taking your own notes as you progress through the book. Towards the end of the book, O'Connell provides two handy appendices. Appendix A is the Bury translation of Plato's dialogues, specifically the parts that are relevant to the Atlantis narrative. The dialogue of Timaeus is very long. Little of it is relevant to Atlantis, so it's nice to have the relevant text isolated from the rest of the dialogue. Appendix B is a list of peoples who have been identified as Atlantean by various other researchers. I want to move on to the things that I like about the book, the things that I think worked particularly well. Early in the book, O'Connell identifies three types of Atlantis enthusiast: the fundamentalist, the fantasist, and the rationalist. O'Connell self-identifies as a rationalist. I think this is self-evident in his work. He understands the contradictions within Plato's texts, the difficulty in both the transmission and translation of the story. Additionally, he admits that it's difficult to determine if something described by Plato is historically accurate or simply an embellishment. O'Connell's overall approach is twofold. He takes the time-tested principles of when, where, who, and how, typically used by investigative journalists. He adds to this by trying to show relevant evidence in a manner that would be found by someone trying to build a legal case to be taken to court. O'Connell is honest enough to provide alternatives to his own ideas, and is often quick to point out the potential shortcomings of his own proposals. O'Connell is also happy to draw on the work of others, giving credit where it's due. I would suggest that some of O'Connell's ideas are better than others, but I think he provides a very strong argument overall. One argument that particularly stood out to me was how so many of the temporal references to the Athenians who were pitted against the Atlanteans strongly tied up with what we know about ancient Greece in the middle of the 2nd millennium BC. I would suggest that O'Connell's argument for the time frame of the Atlanteans is so strong that those who suggest an Ice Age culture need to be able to refute the date provided by O'Connell. Okay, this is a book review, so unfortunately I have to move on to the things that I don't like, and honestly there aren't that many. Firstly, this book is only available on Kindle. The obvious benefit to this, as O'Connell points out, is that the book can be updated as new information comes to light. The downside is that not everybody can access Kindle-based media. I myself am very lucky, as O'Connell kindly sent me a signed and printed paperback, so I can't complain on a personal level. My second big issue with the book is that I would consider there to be one glaring omission. From Atlantopedia, I know that O'Connell is familiar with Driscoll and Kurt's Egyptian Genesis and the notion that the description of Atlantis borrows heavily from ancient creation myths, myths that predate O'Connell's proposed date by many thousands of years. Some of the themes found in these creation mythologies have roots in the various Proto-Indo-European cultures of Eurasia. They can also be found in the creation myths of the Americas. If it can be shown that these themes have a common origin, it would suggest that they date back to at least the end of the last ice age, if we accept the standard model of migration into the Americas. I believe this argument is important enough to be acknowledged in any book regarding Atlantis, even if just to refute the idea in a paragraph or two. Staying with the creation theme for a moment, I think it's possible that the story told to Solon may have shared a common origin with the Egyptian Island of the Egg creation myth. A war took place on the Island of the Egg before the domain was defeated by the enemy serpent, the Great Leaping One. Only this war reads more like a metaphor for a localized cataclysm. If this is the case, then no war took place between Atlantis and Athens. Much of O'Connell's hypothesis hinges on the feasibility of a war between these two powers. For argument's sake, let's just say that O'Connell is correct about his proposed date and location for Atlantis. The creation themes still raise a lot of questions. Is it possible that Solon embellished the description of Atlantis with themes he heard from other cultures? Perhaps knowledge of a Mediterranean Atlantis was lost in the Greek Dark Ages. He needed to describe a foe worthy of the Athenians. There's another way to look at this that might even resolve some of the contradictions in Plato's texts. Is it possible that Solon heard two different stories about two different islands, both lost to the sea, both to the west of Egypt and Athens? It would be easy to understand how these could be conflated. After all, the biographer Plutarch claims that Solon not only spent time in studies with Sonkis of Sais, but also Xenophis of Heliopolis. In addition to my own criticisms, it's also worth taking the opinions of Professor Heinz Günther Nesselrath into account. Nesselrath is a professor of classical philology. His position on Atlantis is that it was a Platonic invention. Nesselrath has reviewed Joining the Dots on the behalf of the Bryn Mawr Classical Review. In his review, he has spotted a number of flaws that O'Connell openly admits require attention. O'Connell hopes to amend these flaws in a revised edition of Joining the Dots, but at the same time he doesn't accept all of Nesselrath's criticisms. I've posted links to both Nesselrath's review and O'Connell's response in the description below. Both are certainly worth a look if you decide to read Joining the Dots. There is some additional feedback, so if you want to look further into this, you can click on the Nesselrath link on O'Connell's Atlantopedia. So with all this said, would I recommend the book? Of course. I would also add to that by suggesting that this is a must-read for any serious student of Atlantology. O'Connell's arguments simply cannot be ignored. The book also serves as a useful reference and gives the reader a broad and honest background in the subject. Some topics that I haven't yet mentioned are particularly important, as O'Connell highlights the need to read several different English translations in addition to Greek copies, in order to try and get your head around some of the ambiguities and contradictions. I appreciate O'Connell's rationalist approach and would particularly emphasize his point that we cannot use channeled readings as evidence for a lost civilization. Back in December last year, it was announced that Atlantopedia would be wound down in 2023 as O'Connell approaches his 80th birthday. After nearly 20 years of work, his intention was to update less frequently. His principal focus would be keeping the extensive web links up to date. However, we can see from his frequent updates that he is still keeping himself busy with Atlantopedia. It would seem that Tony hasn't made up his mind about what he will do with his website, but he will review at the end of this year, 2023, with the possibility of selling the website along with hundreds of books and thousands of papers related to the subject of Atlantis. If a suitable buyer is not found, he may even donate the entire package to a person or institution. Well, if Tony does decide to sell Atlantopedia, I hope he gets a fair price for his immense body of work. His collection of books and papers alone must be worth a decent sum, but at least this sum can be quantified. How do you put a price on a website? In this age of social media, I would suggest that Atlantopedia could be monetized through ad revenue on a platform such as YouTube. Each entry on Atlantopedia could easily be turned into a short YouTube video. perfect for those who prefer to consume their content through this kind of medium. Atlantopedia has 2,360 entries on its index. You can expect to earn at least $4 per 1,000 views on YouTube. Atlantis has long been a popular but also controversial topic, a topic that remains popular on YouTube. As much as I would like to make an offer on Atlantopedia, I don't think I can dedicate the same kind of time and devotion as O'Connell. I hope whoever inherits the website can apply at least a fraction of O'Connell's passion. This is it for this episode. I should have another video out sometime in March. See you soon.